The most dangerous day of a medieval winter wasn't the coldest one. It was some unremarkable day in late February with the sun already creeping back and the pantry almost empty. For you, winter is an inconvenience. A heavier coat, a bigger heating bill. For a medieval peasant, it was a subtraction problem that started at harvest and only had two outcomes: reach spring or don't. Nothing replenished what came out. Every meal was a withdrawal from a supply that couldn't be refilled until the thaw. So how did these people make it through an entire winter with no real heating, no year-round markets, nothing to replace what ran out? The answer has almost nothing to do with warmth. It has to do with math. And the records from the period left that math documented down to the smallest detail, including the year it failed across all of Europe at once. Winter's countdown began long before the first snow. It began in September at the harvest. Everything a family would eat until April or May had to be stored, dried, salted, or buried before November. There was no margin. English manorial rolls show that a good harvest yielded about 7 grains for everyone planted. 7 to 1. Sounds reasonable until you realize one of those 7 had to go back into the ground the following spring. Eating your seed grain meant eating your future. So the real math was 6 to 1, minus the church tithe, minus the Lord's share. What actually reached the family's table was sometimes less than half of what had come out of the soil. The timing is the cruel twist. The deadliest stretch of the year came after the cold had already peaked. March and April, the so-called hungry gap, when stored food was running low and the next harvest didn't exist yet. Demographic studies of pre-industrial populations confirm it. Famine mortality across the northern hemisphere peaked right in that window. Late winter, early spring. The cold was never the thing that killed people. The empty shelf was. But if food was that scarce, what happened to the animals that couldn't graze through the snow? The Anglo-Saxons had a name for November that nobody uses anymore: Blotmonath, Blood Month. The name wasn't poetic. Every year, around November 11th, the feast of Saint Martin Martinmas, rural communities across Europe carried out their annual cull. Not because they wanted to, because the math didn't work any other way. Feeding a full herd through months without fresh pasture would consume the very grain people needed for themselves. So the decision was blunt. Who makes it through winter, the ox or you? Only breeding stock and dairy cows made it past Martinmas. The rest were butchered and preserved within days. The meat went into wooden barrels packed with coarse salt, a method that stopped decay but left the result so salty it needed hours of boiling before anyone could eat it. That's why medieval winter cooking ran on stews and broths, never roasts. That wasn't a culinary choice. It came straight out of how the meat had to be kept. The salt itself was a counted resource. Charlemagne's estate managers tracked salt supplies closely, as recorded in the Capitulare de villis. If the salt ran short, the meat spoiled, and the family went hungry before spring. If the previous harvest had already been poor, the autumn cull stopped being planning and became desperation. Up to this point, the math depended on everything going right. But what happened when the harvest came in bad? Everything got worse. In poor years, English records show the ratio dropped from 7 to 1 all the way down to 2 to 1. 2 grains for every one planted. 1 had to go back into the ground. That left 1. Out of that came the tithe, the Lord's share, and what reached the family was almost nothing. A bad harvest wasn't an isolated event that passed in one season. If you ate your seed grain to survive the winter, there was nothing to plant come spring. If you butchered your draft oxen for meat, there was no way to plow the field in April. The decision to survive this winter was, very often, the decision to doom the next one. There was no good choice, only choices with different deadlines. That was the mechanism that turned a hard winter into a spiral. And between the end of winter stores and the first new harvest, roughly March to June, the spiral hit hardest. The grain was gone. The salted meat, rationed since November, was finishing. The surviving animals were too thin to give milk. The body, too, was nothing like it had been in November. Months of restricted diet had worn resistance down. Infections that would have been a 3-day fever in September became a death sentence. Parish records confirm it. The graveyards filled up in March when bodies that had been running on empty for months finally gave out. Now, imagine that this already tight math took an external hit. Not a slightly worse harvest, a harvest that simply didn't come. A year when the rain wouldn't stop. And then another year just like it. This isn't a worst-case scenario I'm inventing. It happened. In the spring of 1315, it started raining across Europe and didn't stop. The fields were too waterlogged to plant. What did get planted rotted in the ground. The summer harvest failed. And then came winter, with no stockpile. In 1316, it rained again. Same story. The 7-to-1 ratio collapsed to 2-to-1, and in some regions worse. Chroniclers compared the rains to Noah's flood, a downpour so relentless that no one alive had seen anything like it. A 2020 study from Columbia University, published in Nature, analyzed tree rings and confirmed it. The growing seasons before the Great Famine were the 5th wettest period in Europe in over 700 years. City records from Bristol describe 1315 in stark terms, a famine so severe that the living could barely keep up with burying the dead. Families ate their seed grain, they ate their draft animals. In some places, the elderly stopped eating voluntarily so younger family members could survive and keep working the fields. Children were abandoned, and historians believe the tale of Hansel and Gretel, with children left in the forest during a famine, echoes this period. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 is considered the worst famine in European history by proportional mortality. Between 5 and 12% of Northern Europe's population perished from hunger or from diseases hitting a body that had nothing left to fight with. That entire system, the autumn cull, the saved seed, the counted salt, hadn't failed by accident. It had failed because it depended on a margin that was never wide. That's why the November cull, seen from a distance, looks like a quaint folk custom. And seen up close, it was the most important piece of a survival system with no second chances. Every step in that annual cycle existed to push one moment as far into the calendar as possible. The day the shelf went empty. Remember what opened this story? That was the day. The whole system, the Blotmoneth, Charlemagne's salt ledgers, the untouched seed, wasn't built to erase that day, only to delay it. When the system worked, it worked in silence. Nobody recorded the winter where everybody had enough to eat. But when it failed, the cascade fed on itself. You eat the seed grain. Come spring, there's nothing to sow. The next harvest is smaller. The following winter starts with less. Each time, less margin. Seed grain wasn't the only thing eaten out of desperation. Draft oxen went to the butcher when the hunger hit hard enough. An ox took years to raise. No ox, no plowing. No plowing, no harvest at all. The Great Famine triggered exactly this chain. And on top of the hunger came the Great Bovine Pestilence, an epidemic that cut cattle and sheep numbers by as much as 80% in some regions. 4 out of every 5 animals gone. Not from the cull, but from disease, in a herd already stripped thin. It's like someone today selling their house to pay a hospital bill. then finding they have nowhere to live. The immediate fix creates the next problem. Except in the 14th century, there was no insurance, no credit, and the next chance to start over was the summer harvest, if there was an ox to plow and seed to plant. Europe didn't recover when the rain stopped in 1317. Food supplies didn't return to normal until around 1322. 7 years of slow rebuilding, herds wiped out, fields unplowed, families that had lost too many hands to work the land at the old pace. The population that came out the other side was thinner, weaker, with fewer reserves and less room for the next shock. That countdown starting at the September harvest was never really about one winter. It was the rhythm of an entire civilization running without margin. And when the margin finally ran out for good, the damage didn't last one winter. It lasted a generation. The same population weakened by the Great Famine was the one that, 30 years later, met the Black Death. And what the plague did to a body already worn down by decades of incomplete recovery, the records don't need to spell out. That peasant counting grains in September didn't know any of this. He just knew he needed the math to work one more time. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe. There are plenty more where this came from. See you in the next one.